This podcast was made possible by our Leadership Circle members, Becky Morgan, Randy Pond, Lisa Sonsini, and Silver Lake. Special thanks to our 2020 Exemplary Leadership Award sponsors, Friends of Sing Kung, Friends of Webb McKinney, Eris Communications, Deloitte, and HP Inc., and to our Truth, Love, and Reconciliation Dialogue Series sponsor, Destination Home. Welcome to the Dialogue. I'm Suzanne St. John Crane. In November of 2018, American Leadership Forum hosted a retreat called Leading with Purpose, with special guests Ellen Grace O'Brien, author and spiritual director of the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment in San Jose, California, and her friend Ela Gandhi, founder of the Gandhi Development Trust in South Africa that continues the nonviolence work of her grandfather, Mahatma Gandhi. As the retreat was set to begin, ALF Senior Fellow and County Supervisor Dave Cortese walked in with his own special guest, Dolores Huerta, co-founder of the United Farmworkers Movement and renowned nonviolence leader in her own right. The women had never met before, and we at ALF couldn't resist the opportunity to host an impromptu dialogue with Ellen, Ela, and Dolores, facilitated by Supervisor Cortese, on what keeps them leading with purpose in tireless pursuit of a nonviolent world. We share this historic meeting and conversation with you all. Enjoy.
I'm so glad that the three of you have been able to get together all in the same room, essentially otherwise thousands of miles apart, two global nonviolence activists who have led probably two of the top three most significant nonviolence movements in the history of the world together in one room here in Scotts Valley is pretty amazing to me. How about a big round of applause for them? So. I can only imagine the trek to get here, Ela, and the effort and the commitment to be here all week and then travel to other places to continue your efforts. As to Dolores, she's speaking pretty much in a different city every day of the week this week, two of which are, I shouldn't say a different city, back and forth to San Jose a couple of times in the process. She decided yesterday, juggling her schedule, that she would get on the ACE train herself in Stockton at 6:30, 7 o'clock this morning so that she could get down to Diridon Station in San Jose so that she could catch a ride with me up here. So the question is, what inspires all of you to continue to lead with purpose? To get up at 6:30 in the morning, to travel across the country, to keep this busy schedule. All of you do it. I'm familiar enough with what you do. Where's that inspiration come from?
There's always so much more happening than, and I mean good. There's always so much more happening than what we can see on the surface. And when I was walking here this morning, I get these little, one is an acorn, one is a little redwood cone, right? And I looked and it said a redwood tree annually produces 6 to 8 million seeds. And of course, these aren't the seeds are inside this, but they're so tiny that like 8 million of them just weighs about 8 pounds or so, that many seeds. So my spiritual teacher said to me that there is a power for good that runs this universe. Call it whatever you call it. And we can learn to cooperate with that. And that is really what we're here to do, to learn how to cooperate with the highest good. Perhaps your grandfather would say cooperate with truth, with a capital T. And so I believe that's the mission we're on, is to learn how to be in cooperation. You can call it the evolutionary thrust on our planet, the way of awakening. But it is always greater than what we see in any given moment, and it's always at work. I think of it as divine grace. So I would like to point out, of course, I'm celebrating. This is really the first coming out for the book here with you. You're the first public recipients of it. But, this gathering with Dolores and Ela was not planned, right? I mean, it literally just came together spontaneously. The two people that I write about in this book as examples of what it means to live a prosperous life in terms of living your fullness, living your wholeness, and being an instrument that life can use for the well-being of others. The two women that I write about in this book are Ela and Dolores. So I just offer that to you to say, pay attention to what you're dreaming, pay attention to what captures your heart, and follow it.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. And I think, one of the things that Gandhiji said was that we learn from each other. We don't have everything, all knowledge in our minds ourselves. And if you read any of Gandhiji's books, what you will find on the first page is that Gandhiji says that he's not concerned about being consistent, that every day he's learning something new, and that whatever he has said in the past, he still, has the, he asks for, the ability and the freedom to change his mind. So in his book, if you read the first paragraph that he writes in all his literature, all the books that he's written, he says that if he is inconsistent, so if he has had a thought today, he reserves the right to change it tomorrow when he learns something new from people and from his interactions. And he is not going to remain consistent with what he said yesterday, just for the sake of remaining consistent with an idea which, with new knowledge, he knows is an old idea and he wants to change it. So often we, as human beings, want to remain consistent. And I think that that's the first lesson that Gandhiji has taught us, that it's important to remember that all of us are learning. And as we interact with each other, we learn new things. So these encounters are so important to learn new things. So firstly, I want to say when I come here, I haven't come just to speak and tell you something, but to interact and learn from you as much as you may learn from what my experience has been. So I think for me that has been the most important thing, even in my encounter with Ellen and today with Dolores and other people. And I think we learn as we interact with people. So today, that is what I have come here to do, to interact with people and to learn new things, to learn new perspectives, and so on. So I'm hoping that that is what will come out of this discussion. Thank you.
I think what keeps me going is trying to always instill into people an understanding that they have power. And I think when we talk about power, we usually think of power in a negative way. And sometimes we feel, especially women, I want to say, we sort of kind of shy away from that word, that we think, because we think of power as being something destructive. And Helen Keller said that science has not found the solution for one of the world's greatest illnesses or evils, and that is apathy. And so when we look at the world around us and we see what is happening, and we mourn that maybe only 50% of the people that could vote voted, that people that are in their communities can make a change, but they don't get involved. And so to me, when I met Fred Ross Sr., and he showed me that I could have power. And I like to tell this story, but I take a minute to tell the story. And, there was a movie that was made about my work with the Farmworkers Union called Dolores, it was produced by Carlos Santana. And in seeing that documentary, it kind of had a lot of flashbacks for me. And I remember when we first started the Community Service Organization, which is an organization that Cesar and I belonged to before we started the United Farmworkers. And Fred and I were in Stockton. That's where we organized a chapter of that group. And there was a gentleman who came to our office who had suffered a stroke. He was a farm worker. And he was on crutches, and he had a family. And so I was going to take him down to the welfare office so he could make an application for disability. And when we went to the office, the woman there would not let him make an application. And I didn't know what to do. I went back to the office and I said I couldn't help him because this woman would not let us make an application. And Fred Ross said to me, "You go down to that office right now and you demand to see a supervisor." And I thought, wow, I can do that. And now he didn't call ahead and say I was going. He didn't say, "I'm going to go with you." He said to me, "You go down there right now." And so I did. I went down there with this gentleman and I demanded to see the supervisor and said they didn't let him make an application. And, well, they had to let him make an application and he got a disability. Well, that to me was such a big sense of the fact that I could do that I had the power to be able to help this man. And it was just like a big light bulb. Now, I had, gone to college. I had been involved in a lot of social organizations, I was a Girl Scout for 10 years. But I had never knew, and I always wanted, all these organizations I belonged to, these social groups, why can't we make changes? Why? And so Fred Ross taught me how you can make changes. And doing that, organizing that we do, how we formed the Farmworkers Union, and with getting together with people in their homes, like Tupperware, I always like to say the word Tupperware because a lot of people can relate to that. A few people at a time, 6 people, 8 people, 4 people, and explaining to them how they can change the situations in their communities, and that they have the power to do it, because people don't know they have the power to do that. And then once you show them pictures, like when Fred Ross, with the house meeting that I went to, when I got organized, he showed us pictures of things that people were in big meetings like this one. I had never seen more than 10 people in a meeting in my life. And that they had been able to bring in streetlights and sidewalks, clinics into their communities in East Los Angeles, and how they showed clippings of how they had sent police to prison for beating up Mexican-American kids. And I thought, I want to belong to that organization, right? Because having suffered the same kind of police harassment in my community. And to me, so my purpose when I think about the more people I can reach, the more people I can talk to, the more people I can convince that they have power, I want to keep on doing it. until every last breath that I can have the health and the energy to do it. So, and then also to bring people the message about how to end racism and sexism and misogyny and homophobia in our society, to make people get that understanding, because I think a lot of people, when we think of why do we have so much racism in our society, because people forget, number one, that we are one human family. I like to say that we are all Africans, because this is where our human race began, in Africa. We can kind of remind people who we are, that we're one human family. And then I guess I have to throw in real quick about the whole issue of nonviolence, which Cesar Chavez was such a devotee of nonviolence. And I was too. I had read, when I was in college, I read everything I could about Gandhi. And since I'm quite old, I remember Mahatma Gandhi and followed everything that he was doing. And when we put that philosophy into our movement of the Farmworkers Movement, when we had people that were being killed, people that were being beaten, and yet to be true to the whole issue of nonviolence and the kind of spiritual strength that gives you. But I just want to add this in there, that, in the Indian language, the word nonviolence, and I'm going to mispronounce it because I haven't used it recently.
Satyagraha.
It's an action word. And when we think again, I always think of the English language, what a violent language it is. And so in English we say non-violence. It's like two negatives, right? And so we think of it sometimes, a lot of people think non-violence means that you just don't do anything. You're like it's got a very mild tone. But in the Indian language, the word for nonviolence is an action word, So it means that we have to act if we want to really promote nonviolence and teach it, that it's got to be an action, something that we have to make it very intentional, right? So I guess I said a lot right there, but that's kind
great.
of the basis of my work.
That's wonderful. And I'd like to ask Ela to pick up, if you don't mind. I mean, first of all, let me just say you can talk about whatever you want. So don't be at all constrained about my questions. But I had written down here this difference between passive and active nonviolence, and certainly something we've heard so much from the Gandhi tradition over the years and been replicated by Dr. Martin Luther King, by Dolores and Cesar Chavez, really the three major movements around the world that best exemplified this, what Dolores was just talking about. And if you wouldn't mind expanding on that a little bit. I have a colleague, Cindy Chavez, who many in the room know, but she'll wake us up sometimes around organizing, because organizing by nature requires action, right? See, someone will give some polling or something like that and say, people are for this. And she will always say, it doesn't just happen. It doesn't just happen. And people who think we're in a bubble here in California and everything just goes the way it's supposed to go around immigration and all these issues, it doesn't. And I just would like to hear you talk about the work, of being active. You're certainly an activist, qualified to tell us about that.
Yeah, well, the first thing is that Gandhiji didn't like the word nonviolence because it's a negative word, non-violence. And so he then asked people to find a term that gives the true meaning of the action that he was advocating, because he wasn't saying that you just don't do things, but it was a very positive terminology for him. So then the word Satyagraha was coined. And that came out of a number of essays that people were asked to read, because he advertised in his newspaper, for a term that can be used to describe the movement, instead of describing it as nonviolent movement. And so people were asked to write a little essay and come up with a name for that movement. And that's how the term Satyagraha came about. Now, Satyagraha means the force of truth. So it's a very active term. And when I say the force of truth, it still doesn't describe the entire Satyagraha, the word, the terminology, because in Sanskrit, it has much more power. And so, you know, when you read about it, you get to know the full meaning of what this means. It's not just the force of truth, but it is a much greater sort of philosophy that the word, the term, expresses. Now, for instance, in South Africa, we have a term, Ubuntu, and many of you might have heard about that term. But again, there's a whole philosophy that's behind that term. So it's only one word, but it means a lot more. So in the same way, Satyagraha, nonviolent struggle, is described as Satyagraha, Gandhiji's nonviolent struggle. And when you look at the force of truth, which is how we would translate it, you would find that firstly, it's not a negative term. It doesn't say that you don't do certain things, but it actually says that you have to do much more in order to achieve something greater than what you see. So if you want to change things, then you use Satyagraha as a methodology to change things. And Satyagraha then has, comprises of a number of actions. So it's not, like nonviolence now can be interpreted as being just absence of violence. So you sit back and you see a whole lot of things happening, but you are not going to act because you are nonviolent. So you sit back and you watch all these things happening and do nothing about it. That's not what Gandhiji said. He said you have to act. So it's the force of action. The actual, word Satyagraha means that you act. You don't just accept. When you see something, wrong happening, then it's a duty that you correct that. But you correct it in a nonviolent way. So nonviolence is the kind of action that you would take. It describes the methodology, but it doesn't describe the fact that you have to do something about it. Don't accept an injustice or something wrong that is being done. So I know that on one occasion, for instance, and this he writes about in his autobiography, that when he came to South Africa, after he had criticized the government for the strategies that the government was using, the racist strategies and so on that were happening in South Africa, he had criticized it when he was in India. He brought out a little pamphlet. And largely the white community in South Africa had read reports of this. And the report was a bit distorted. the way it was, communicated to the South African public. And so the white community in South Africa got very angry about this. And so when Gandhi returned to South Africa, they initially didn't allow the ship to dock at the port. And after many days of negotiations between the shipping company and the government and the community, they were allowed to disembark. But what happened is that there was a whole group of white people who wanted to attack Gandhi for what he had said, because they felt that he had insulted the South African people and, cast aspersions about them and so on. So there was a whole group of them who wanted to attack him. The company knew that this was going to happen, so they had sent his family away. And when he was asked to come down from the ship, he was found, somebody recognized him, and a mob tried to attack him. They did attack him, in fact. And it was the superintendent's wife who had an umbrella, and she opened the umbrella and held it in front of Gandhi. And that's how she saved him from being further beaten up or killed even. And the people then ran away from there. And that's how Gandhiji was saved from being killed by a mob on that occasion. So what I was saying is that the nonviolent struggle is about standing for the truth. And he stood for the truth because he didn't prosecute these people. A lot of the people there said that you should prosecute them. And he said no, they didn't have the information, correct information. And he then wrote letters to the press and explained what he had written in India, what he had said, because what he was trying to say is don't send more indentured workers to South Africa, because the indenture system is not a good system. This is what happens to people when they are indentured, because for 5 years they are virtually under slave conditions. They have absolutely no rights, legal rights. And this is what he explained in the pamphlet. He didn't attack the white community as such, but he attacked the system of slavery. And he explained this in his letters to the press. And that is how people began to know what he was doing. And a lot of people then respected him rather than, regard him as an enemy. So this was one of the things that Gandhiji did. And this is how he explained the Satyagraha. He started the Satyagraha movement, which was a non-violent struggle against what he thought was evil or what was not acceptable. So you firstly define what is it that is unacceptable. And never in the description of unacceptable is a person unacceptable. This we should understand very clearly, because he always said people do things because of their own understanding. And therefore, we have to change that understanding. So it's not the person that's at fault, but the understanding is the problem. So you separate the deed from the doer. This is what Gandhiji's, whole philosophy was, that the doer is a person, and that person has been misled or thinks differently. You can change that. So don't attack the person, but you attack the deed, what the person is doing, because his interpretation of that particular situation is different, or it's misled, or something to that effect. And therefore, we have to change that idea that the person has got in his mind. And that is what Satyagraha is, that is the meaning of Satyagraha. It means the force of truth. And so you have to discover the truth and then begin to implement the truth, and to those people who don't realize that what they are doing is wrong, to show them that this is wrong, what you are doing, and to get them to change. So that's the whole idea of Satyagraha. And that is what he tried to explain.
Thank you. Reverend O'Brien, thoughts on the same theme here? You didn't have an opportunity to talk about how you see what we call nonviolence movement in the Carry the Vision tradition. Well, you're a poet, you're a writer. What's the English word for what Mahatma Gandhi was saying?
Well, for me, because the Sanskrit has a lot of nuance that we don't have so much in English with these words. It's the force of truth, but it also means holding fast to truth. Holding to truth. And so as a spiritual teacher, for me, of course, part of that focus is exploring what is the ultimate truth about human life. Who are we really? And Dolores was speaking of that in her talk, and Ela, of course, has touched on it, that, we are all equal. We are all divine beings. And so the ultimate truth is that people have equal worth, equal value. And that is something that we have to keep our eyes open to, where there is some teaching that is not true about the nature of people. Last night, the talk was about racism and how racism makes it convenient for people to oppress other people. The only way it can be done is through that lens. And for me, what is behind that is the deepest root is ignorance of the truth about all people. And so spiritually, this truth is, there's a small t truth, which is the truth of what is happening, but there's a large T truth, which is the truth about the reality of every human being and the value and worth of every life, and the truth about our connection to one another and how vital it is, and that we cannot thrive at the expense of others, nor can we ultimately thrive at the expense of our planet, which of course we are seeing today. So this truth is really that we are one. We are connected with one another. We are all equally human. We are all equally divine. And we are one with the earth as well. And so that is the truth, that we are called to live in our lifetime and think about how it is we take our rightful place in that network of oneness, and how it is that we live in a way that contributes to lifting up others and contributes to the wellness of life on this planet at this time. Did I answer the question?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We are needing to wrap up here momentarily. I'm wondering if we could just ask Dolores and Ela for kind of a call to action to close. Each of you, just for a minute or two, if we were in a house meeting, if we were in those early days of Fred Ross and the movement, if we were in the early days of your grandfather's movement, what would be the call to action now to the folks here, to this room? What should they do, or organize them, or leave them with one final thought about organizing themselves? Thank you.
Well, I think what you just talked about, truth. And I know that there's been a statement that the truth will set us free. And I have been saying that I believe that the one way that we solve our national dilemma, you might say, is through the truth, through education. And we have the structure in our society in terms of our educational system, but we have to change the content of what we teach. And I think that this is something that is doable, starting with our pre-kindergarten children, to talk about how this country was formed, how this was a brown country when our founding fathers of the government made that constitution, which we know was not a really fair constitution to begin with. But just reminding people that, again, as I mentioned before, that we were all one human family, that we are all Africans of different shades and colors. And I like to say to the KKK and the alt-right neo-Nazis, get over it, you're Africans, okay? Just get over it, okay? And you know, the contributions of the people of color that built the United States of America, the Native Americans were the first slaves. And David and I are having conversations about how we do a healing in our country. But first, before we have a healing, we have to have a confessional, like they did in South Africa, and led by our Native American leaders, and to forgive all of us for what we did to the first slaves in the United States, Native Americans, and the African slaves that built the White House and the Congress in Monticello, where Thomas Jefferson lived, you know, and the fact that he never released his slaves. And all of these, you know, terrible things, and all the immigrants that came to build our country, the United States. And we need to include that in our books, in our school books, so that our white children won't be poisoned with that poison of white supremacy and white privilege. And our children of color will get the dignity that they deserve for what their people did to build this country. I think the truth. And I think as a mission for all of the work that you've been doing for so many years, because I can't think of any other organization that has promoted nonviolence the way that you have. And that we include nonviolence as part of the curriculum. And the respect for women, you know, so that women do not have to be victims of harassment or rape or being murdered by their partners. As we know, women are, as we sit here, I like to say somewhere a woman is getting beaten, raped, or murdered while we sit here right now. You know, so these are things that can be changed through education. But we've got to take over education. We've got to take over the school districts. And we've got to, when we talk about, as you mentioned, about getting rid of slavery, that Gandhi was, you know, his purpose, that poverty is a form of violence, and that the resources of our planet need to be shared by everyone. And yeah, they use the S word, socialism. If that's what it is, it needs to be, I like to refer to Cuba. I don't know if anybody here has been to Cuba in the audience. Any hands here? All right, they will affirm what I'm saying, okay? That in Cuba, everybody has a pre-college education, everybody has free health care, and it is a very poor country. So we have to learn from these other countries what they're doing right and we're doing wrong. But I think that we can do it, but it's going to take the will, the participation of all of us in our democracy to make sure that it happens. And, so we have an obligation, because nonviolence is an obligation. This is what you said, And I know my mother was a devotee of St. Francis, and she taught us when we were little kids, when you see somebody that needs help, you're obligated to help them, and don't expect gratification or reward. But the resources of our world need to be shared by everyone. There's no reason why we, the richest country in the world, why we should have homelessness or poverty or lack of education. Sí se puede.
Closing call to action before lunch. Give us something to think about on the way over to the lunchroom, please.
I think there's a quote, from Gandhiji. He said that there's a sufficiency in the world to meet the needs of all the people, but not the greed of any one person. So I think that explains that, we have enough for us not to have poor and deprived people in the world. If only we could share the resources of the world amongst all the people in a way that every individual has their basic needs served. Their, home, shelter, medical aid, things like that. If every individual has access to those things, then you won't have so much of violence. You wouldn't have the kind of strife that we see in today's world. Mm-hmm. So this was one of the things that Gandhiji was also trying to establish. And he had an economist called Dr. Kumarappa. And he has written a number of books. You can get them on the internet. And it's about the economy and how people can change the economy so that every person has their basic needs met. And once that happens, then people are satisfied and would be happier than they are at present. And Gandhiji said that when you are starving, when your family is starving, then you can't go and talk to that person about nonviolence or about anything. Spirituality, nothing can be explained to a person who is starving and that person's family is starving. So the first thing that we need to do is to ensure that all our people have, sufficiency to be able to survive.
To make all of this great things happen, we have to get good representation. People, elect people like Dave Cortese, okay? But the question I want to ask you all is a really simple one. And the question is, who's got the power, okay? And I want you to yell out, we've got the power. And when I say what kind of power, please yell out, people power. Let's do it. Who's got the power?
We got the power.
What kind of power?
People power.
So are we going to go out there and work to make sure that we change our educational system, that we spread the word of nonviolence? What do we say? ¿Se puede o no se puede?
Sí se puede.
Okay, let's all do it with an organized hand clap. Everybody together. Let's go. Sí se. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
ALF joins and strengthens diverse leaders, creating and supporting networks for good. We hope you enjoyed this podcast and encourage you to subscribe to The Dialogue on iTunes or SoundCloud. To learn more about ALF, visit us online at alfsv.org.